the tone, the stone, the splash, the splish-splosh where the thing sort of happened, but was resisted for that vital second of confrontation by the hard surface of the water, willing its stillness. And we hear these alternatives sounding, plash, splosh, spray, but silence them in a decision that what mattered was the violence of the stone pulled to the center of the earth. And yet, they resist, tracing a polyrhythm of futures past and dreams of futures in the weaving ripples which dance in our rebel memories, our borderless desire. I understand confusion, our composer Elena Rykova writes, as a wandering state of a puzzled mind which makes continuous attempts to cross the borders of its own limits, but fails to do so, against which she opposes illusions of order. And confusion may be confused, alienation alienated by the gaze, the listening, the thinking, which can bear the pain of contradiction, can journey into the multiple chords hidden in a discordant flame. So the luminous agonies of Drorfila's lament, which we just heard, written by the son of a communist kibbutz who would no longer wear the uniform of an IDF, and became Swedish, a bleeding exploration of the paradox that honoring the highest truths of your kin may require the pain of shedding the skin of the nation. When we think of history, we assume singular events marching in a chain gang. But what if we brought the methods of Anna Maria Avram, listening to events and their alternatives, as part of a polyphonic order? What if we superimposed on the now earlier historical conjunctures, denying the privilege of the late, which depends on a temporary preponderance of power and violence, opening up history into a system of overlapping possibilities, some forced into the silence, pushed into dark invisibility, but still alive, still resisting, still audible. What time is it now? Broken rope, broken Europe, Brexit or no exit? Or is it Rexit, the eve of the Tory imposition of a brutal shock doctrine in Britain, which will make Margaret Thatcher look like Rosa Luxemburg? But what are we remaining for? Not the pain of austerity which generated millions of votes for Leave in 2016. The pain of living as surplus, jobless, food banks, teachers buying crayons for schools, the NHS cracking under the strain each winter, sick people sanctioned because they can't work, a Britain in which we learned this week that 4 million children now live in poverty. Nor can we remain as a hostile environment where people, inevitably black and brown, are ripped from their families, placed in invisible prisons like Yarlswood, then deported in chains like slaves. And do we want to remain for the Europe of Wolfgang Schäuble and Gordon Brown and David Cameron, where the poor of Greece and Britain pay the gambling debts of the bankers? Or the Europe of Orban, of Salvini, of Macron, a Europe of repression and tear gas, of xenophobia, hate and self-hate? And what about the 30,000 people who have died trying to migrate to Europe since the 1990s? 2,000 of them drowning in the last year, turning the Mediterranean finally into Homer's wine-dark sea. This is the discordant, painful music of our historical now. But what if we explored the pain of this tangle, our current predicament to its origins, sounding with it the alternatives silenced in the making of the present, but which still resonate, lost futures on whose submerged weight we might build future projects, illuminating its truth and its most generous human potentials. For the now we're living in is built on the violent suppression of another now, which resonates in our historical and political unconscious, which resonates in our desires, an ancient now, which found its sounding in 1945, at the end of the horrors of the Second World War. People around the world demanded a different world: housing, health, education and food would be shared on the basis of need, not on the ability to pay. Free at the point of service, the NHS is the last triumphant symbol of that heroic age. And this was a global vision. What the left wanted in the late 1940s, Aimé Césaire, the poet, for example, newly elected as a communist deputy to the French Parliament for Martinique in 1945, was to turn Europe's empires into federations, in which national self-determination would be combined with a collective project of development. In these federations, the same political, economic, and social rights would be shared by everyone, wherever they were born. The borderless despotism of European imperialism would be turned into a world of borderless human rights and welfare, a world to each according to their need. In this spirit, the British Nationality Act of 1948 declared that wherever you were born in the British Empire, you shared a common British citizenship. It was under that premise that the Windrush migrants sailed to England, and it underpinned a forgotten project for a united socialist states of Europe. The enemies of this dream of equality, those whose wealth and privilege would have had to be broken to realize it, moved rapidly against it. Already by the end of the 1940s, the partner of the official Cold War was the expulsion of radical egalitarianism from the centre ground of European politics, and the very rapid rehabilitation of fascists in Italy and Nazis in Germany, and the same policeman who had deported Jews in Paris during the Second World War and tortured resistance now was put in place to crush Algerians. And Stalin collaborated. The deal he cut with Churchill at Yalta was that the security of the USSR would be guaranteed by a board of East European client states, in exchange for the communist parties of France, Italy, and Greece demobilizing and disarming. The young CIA deployed the Corsican mafia on the docks of Marseille and the Sicilians in Genoa to break the radical trade unions, while at the same time grooming and funding the right wing in socialist parties across the continent. Churchill and others launched then a very different idea of a European movement, a Cold War alliance which would bind conservative interests across the continent, hardwiring private property and bourgeois processes of electoral democracy. And it is that Christian Democrat and right-wing social democrat idea of Europe which underpinned the European common market and remains powerful in the EU. For what the Lexiters hate about Europe, and they're not wholly wrong, is the way in which a web of treaty and law, subject to technocratic arbitration rather than democratic will, tries to limit what democratic governments can do. The 1945 dream of cradle-to-grave welfare, of a world dedicated to the complete realization of human potential, was diminished into limited provisions which aimed to reproduce worker consumers within the national boundaries of each European state. The corollary of this was decolonization. For one of the forgotten drivers of the end of the European empire in the late 1950s and early 60s was the refusal of European elites to bear the redistribution of wealth, which would have allowed for citizens of colonies to have the same welfare rights as those in Europe. And so, a new world of national borders descended. But here's the paradox. These borders now operated to deny people from Gabon or Nigeria or Jamaica or Bangladesh the right to migrate to France or England. But oil companies like Elf Aquitaine or British Petroleum or Europe's banks, the world remained borderless for them. It is worse. Through Europe's murder of people like Patrice Lumumba and Mehdi Ben Barka, dissolved in a vat of acid in 1965, through repeated military and court interventions, through bringing corrupt despots like Idi Amin, Mobutu, and Bokassa into power, through IMF and World Bank interventions, African decolonization meant for millions war and poverty. There has been a 50-year war going on in the Congo region, from which people were driven to the desperate choice of trying to migrate, to get over the frontier, to where the world's wealth, much of it taken from their places of birth, is being hoarded. Those migrants drowning in the Mediterranean are in search of making good the lost promises of Europe. They come to remind us of our own forgotten dreams and best hopes. And yet the 1945 ideal continued to drive projects in the late 20th century for a different Europe and a different world. Willy Brandt in the 1970s championed in a new form the old idea of Europe and the Third World becoming a new space of cooperation and shared development, economic and social rights. And Social Democrats aimed the 1980s and 1990s through a new European Union, at least within the space of the continent, to create common living standards from Lisbon to Gdansk. That promise remains alive in the magic of the blue and yellow starry flag. And yet, it is true that the same grey men as before work to limit its promise, to wield the tyranny of the ballot sheet, treaties and charters, to ensure that the Europe des peuples became instead the Europe of the bankers. The EU became a vehicle for writing the autonomy and privileges of property into law, of states which work for and around the needs of capital, true for the neoliberal reform programme and for its tightening after 2009 in what we call austerity, and what threatens now, a new dark age of inequality protected by xenophobia and state violence. And yet, the flame of that old generous idea of what it means to be human, of what Europe should and could be, continues to burn in us. The evil cynics who marketed the Leave campaign knew its power as an object of collective desire. £350 million a week for the NHS. So, if I am a Remainer, it's not to remain in the EU of Tony Blair or the Yellow Tories or of Tusk and Macron. I burn instead for a different idea of Europe, a Europe built around human needs and the cultivation of every person's gifts, a Europe of such a precious and complex lace tapestry of borders, of language, of dialects, dances, songs, reaching to the border of Kazakhstan, from which Elena Raikova comes, to the Black Sea and Balkans crossed with the metro of Paris of Anna Maria Avram, to the diasporic galaxy of East Europe, Palestine, Sweden of Dorofila, to North and West Africa and the Americas, a Europe through whose borders pass freely all the tributaries of humanity, in oneness and difference. And I want to try something now. Can you pick that up? Now you'll hear from the hinterland of your musical memory sounds that are coming from far away. Some will be coming from the Arab world. Some will be coming from North Africa. Some will come from West Africa. Some will coming from my part of the world and the other side of the water. Fly high.